Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another popular culture dialogue. I'm here with my stylish headphones because it's a little bit noisy today. But we're here to talk about fandom and popular culture. And I think it could be a really interesting conversation and one that we might need other dialogues down the line to get at more specific relationships and issues related with these topics. But I'm here joined with a lot of lovely people, a lot of lovely scholars, and I'm going to throw it to them like we do to introduce themselves and what brings them here. So I'm going to start off with, and I feel this is kind of like the Brady Bunch layout right now. Let's go over to Brianna first.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna. I am a second-year PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, focusing a lot on music and Philadelphia and sort of the urban foundations that helped create Philadelphia soul and hip-hop, and some of the memory and consumption around those two genres.
Very cool. I didn't know that Philadelphia had a specific music scene. I'm not sure I remembered that from last time. So thank you. Wonderful to have you here, Brianna.
Thank you.
We're gonna go from Brianna down to Maria.
That'd be me. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Alberto. I am a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Utah, working on my degree in English and Cultural Studies. And my kind of angle into popular culture is I'm really interested in how pieces of popular culture are often seen or treated to function as texts, and how fans kind of work with that fact. So that's very much what I'm interested in at the moment.
That's wonderful. That's exactly kind of what I wanted to get us going with this first dialogue on the intersection between these two concepts. So great to have you here. And we're going to go down then to Colleen.
Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of South Carolina, getting my degree in English literature. My focus is on pop culture as a reflection of cultural values, but I have worked a lot with fan studies in the past, mostly as a way to look at fan fiction as literature and literature as fan fiction, but I like to look at fandom as a way of seeing how fans interact with cultural texts and the way that fandom can be a way to a lens to view cultural values.
Wonderful. All kinds of great intersections for the topic that we're talking about today. So wonderful to have you here, Colleen. And I'm going to go over from Colleen to Benjamin.
Should be unmuting, I think. 1 a.m. brain, I think. Hello, everyone. So I'm Ben, working as an assistant professor at the University of Sydney here. And I'm also in comparative culture and translation studies. Right now I'm working on this intersection of content communities and Netflix. So that's something I'm interested in. And I've actually been talking about popular culture and fandom today to my class, talking about subbing and dubbing and fan subbing and dubbing in Japanese anime manga. And we talked about like this weird relationship, you know, when money comes in and it kind of destroys all the passion that goes into that community. So yeah, really keen to talk to you all about it and hear more about it from all of you.
And that passion, that's a good word to bring in today. And I think that's going to be one we're going to come back to a lot in our conversation. So thank you. Go up from Benjamin to Sorcha. And I know I'm butchering it, so please do correct me.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sorcha. I'm a senior lecturer in film studies and American studies over at Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm one of the founding members of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies as well. So work a lot mostly on popular culture, American popular culture and horror. So my interest in this is coming from the intersections of fandom and popular culture studies, kind of, because I think both systems have been sort of disavowed, and I think this needs to be some sort of open recuperation and open understanding of what's going on between those two kind of callings, if they are indeed two separate things, which we'll discuss today. So really happy to be here. Thank you.
Good. And I like that because you're already getting at the dialogue part of the popular culture dialogue and talking about, you know, making amends and maybe bringing us back together if we've gone our separate ways. So wonderful to have you here. I'm going to go up slightly then to Kristine. Ketel, and I have to go then down to Kristine, the other one.
It's confusing when you have popular names. Hi, I'm Kristine Ketel. I'm interested in AI, robots, and transhumanism. I start an interdisciplinary American Culture Studies PhD program this fall at Bowling Green State University. And I'm looking at what is it going to mean to be human in a world where humans continue to to technologically enhance themselves, becoming less biological, at the same time that our AI is getting smarter and our robots are becoming more human-like. So where will that definition be in the future? From a culture standpoint, from particularly a pop culture standpoint, that conversation's been a little poisoned by all of the robot uprising movies we've seen over the years. And so every time I start this conversation, invariably somebody says, "Oh, Blade Runner," or something along those lines. And so I'm interested in where that goes. I haven't really thought about fandom before, but I'm sort of looking at fandom and comic, this robot identity. And I'm interested in learning from you guys that have been studying this longer, is where we are in that crossover between pop culture and fandom. And again, like many others have said, super happy to be here. Thank you again, Gary Lynn, for putting this together.
Wonderful. Glad to have you here, Kristine, and looking forward to more of what you are able to accomplish once you start your PhD program. And let's go down then to the lovely Kristine Tomlinson.
Hello. So I'm Kristine Tomlinson. I'm a lecturer at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm also doing work with the Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser University. I mostly work with video games and geek spaces, but I do a lot of looking at pop culture content as well as fan behaviors, fan expressions, and identity building within fan groups.
That identity is going to be an interesting one to think about too when we think about popular culture and fandom and how they relate to one another. And it kind of brings us back to the robotic versus biologic. Ooh, new word, biologic. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about too. How does identity come into it? And last but not least, let's go down to Linda.
Hi, everybody. I'm Linda Howell. I'm an assistant director at the University of North Florida. And also the director of the writing program. And so my interest in fan studies is long and complicated, but right now I'm interested in two strains. One is I'm working with Terry Lynn on kind of looking at QAnon and the intersection of fan practice and the emergence of QAnon as a phenomenon. The other thing that I've been working on for several years is really the metatextual space between fans and the authorized content creators. And how that changes the context that's being created. And it creates a hermeneutic crisis in terms of not only identity building, but what constitutes canon. And so that's been the bulk of my writing for quite a while. So.
Wonderful. Glad to have you here, Linda, as always. Glad to have everyone here. So let's dive in then. I gave you all a preview, so hopefully you've had a little time to think about it, and it's not going to be like a deer in headlights moment, but okay. Rather than just talk about, how fandom and popular culture are similar to and different from one another, let's dive into perhaps a more of an existential question. Do fandom and popular culture need each other to exist? Would you have popular culture without fandom and vice versa?
So can I jump in here?
Go for it.
So one of the things that I've really been thinking about for a while now is so a lot of times we talk about fandom in a paratextual ways, right? That they're kind of annotated spaces. And for me, it's really more about symbiotic and symbiotext, right? So that there is a dependence upon these texts with their reception. And that, it becomes kind of a Rubian, self-cycle, right? It's like they can't really exist outside the other. The problem, I think, that the existential problem is in that authorship rate, is that there are times when popular culture wants to be separate, popular culture texts want to be separate from their reception, when in fact that they're not, and so I don't think that they can. I think that there is this kind of organic, almost, I think of Deleuze here, right? There's kind of this very much this rhizomatic structure that we can't get beyond. At least that's the way I read it. And so that's my perspective. Sure.
Feel free to jump in when you have something to say. That's why I keep my mic live, so I can just jump in whenever.
I like the idea of it as a symbiotic relationship, because I think it is really hard to separate the two of them. If you think about it, I mean, what is fandom without popular culture? What are you going to be a fan of, right? And then what is popular culture without the fans? What makes it popular if you don't have the fans? So I think that, yeah, maybe they are kind of interlinked in a way that we can't really separate, because when you really get down to it, each of them do maybe need each other in this way. And I do like what you said, Linda, about maybe sometimes them wanting to be separate from each other. And I can think of several examples of popular culture properties that do want to push away from their fans. Part of I've studied before is toxic fandom and toxic fan groups that have caused fan properties to disavow their fans, right? And who would be like, we're not with them. But that's not something you can really say. Like, fandom is kind of, you can't disavow them completely. They're still part of the experience of that property. So I think that was a really interesting way to think about it. Oh yes, I like what you said, Maria, in the chat. No true Scotsman fallacy. That really does link in here. Like, yeah, you can't separate the fan from the fandom. You can't separate the fandom from the property fully, because I do think that they are really linked.
Brianna?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how well this is going to connect, but I don't do a lot of fan studies, and I would like to, and incorporate some of that into the reading for my my dissertation and beyond that. But I was thinking about it as, and I could be completely wrong, but popular culture being like the umbrella, and things sort of branching off of that, and going with what Linda and Colleen were saying, like, you can't necessarily be separate, because it seems like they, like you're all saying, need each other. Like, if you didn't have pop culture as the theory or the association, whatever it might be, you wouldn't have different kinds of popular culture to study. Is what when I was thinking about, the question that you sent, that's kind of where my mind was going with that.
I would add to that. I'm sorry, Maria.
Something else that a couple of different people were mentioning that's kind of pinging for me. So one of my advisors right now is recommending that I look into media industry studies, and what that is kind of bringing to the table here is that, okay, I won't dig into this whole conversation, but one of the ways in which high culture and low culture are distinguished, rightfully or wrongly, is who is consuming them, right? Who are they open to consumption by? So if you even want to narrow it down to this really mercenary concern of consumption, well, it makes sense for that type of culture to have consumers who are invested in consuming it multiple times, all the properties that come with it, all the spin-offs that come with it, and who will proselytize it to other people for free. you get a free built-in marketing team. So again, even if you just want to think of it in these purely mercenary commercial terms, it makes a lot of sense for popular culture and fandom to be connected in that kind of way.
Given,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
oh, yeah. As an extension of that, Maria, thinking about, because it's something that Brianna was saying, and I wanted to pick up on it, it's like also thinking about how fans function in the distribution, right? So, I mean, like you were saying with media industry, I mean, they function not only as proselytizers, right? They function as missionaries, as conversion, you know, they're converting you. And not only that, I mean, one of the things I'm also interested in is how fans also become the priests of the texts, right? They become the kind of the avenues through which people not only access the text, but access the meaning making of the text, right? And so now you have this kind of multi-layered kind of, you know, and I hate to say hierarchy because there is a hierarchy, but there's not, right? There's this kind of system in place and almost like this vetting, like the closer you get within the fandom, right, to the text, that really changes how you identify with the text. So, yeah.
So what I just found interesting that just pinged into my head while Maria and Linda were both talking is, given what both of you just said, fandom now, we've been talking about fandom and pop culture, but fandom applies to high culture as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it does, and they might not like that name for themselves, which is a whole nother dialogue and an interesting piece. I say this is someone coming from like Tolkien fandom. So, yes.
Right.
Or they call themselves academics.
Yeah, I taught a class on fan fiction last semester, and none of my students knew they were signing up for a class on fan fiction, which is interesting. So we had to start the semester defining fandom. And so I had to get them to explore whether or not they were actually involved in fandom. And we had to go through the, yeah, you're actually involved in fandoms you didn't realize. So we had that experience of, yeah, you don't like the word, but guess what? You're actually in fandom. So yeah, the word throws some people off, but they're also very much involved.
I think somehow fan synonymous in common lingo, and but Colleen, I'll bet that exercise for your students was really, really helpful when they figured out that they were a fan of their local art museum or their local football team or their local knitting club, or, you know, whatever it was they were a fan of, they were in that group. I bet that really was helpful and eye-opening.
The university sports team was the big one, because, you know, my university is big in local college sports. So being like, hey, guess what? You're all Gamecocks fans was a big one for them. But yeah, getting them to understand. And I think that's another thing is if we're talking about a dialogue between fandom and popular culture, one of, I think, the distinct differences is that popular culture is a lot more understood and accepted than fandom, mostly because fandom is misunderstood a lot of because of the name, because of the associations people have with the name, because of kind of the negative connotations that people have, despite the fact that, yes, so many people are fans of sports, or, you know, how many people are fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe because they go and they see the movies, or Star Wars, and they, you know, they argue about which is the best Star Wars movie. These are all conversations I had with my students, and none of them would have thought of themselves as part of a fandom before they started my class. And yet we had these conversations within the first couple of weeks, and that completely changed their minds. They all thought about pop culture, right? Because everybody talks about pop culture. It's the water cooler culture conversations that we all have. So why do we treat fandom so differently? Like, what makes it the dirty secret nobody wants to talk about?
Can I come in there?
Yeah.
That is such an interesting point that you were making, Colleen. I think that there is an issue there, because when you're trying to teach popular culture, or trying to legitimize it, or say that, you know, it's important for us to understand where our experience of the world through popular culture, because it is sort of that Rorschach of our experience in the world. It's how we do it. I think that there's something really interesting there, because if pop culture has a sliver of legitimacy within the sort of stuffier echelons of academia, at least anyway, if it has a sliver of that, then fandom really does not. Because I think then that there is something to do with, in those perceptions, understandably, but in the sense that fandom is seen as something that is of low culture, of low value, of opinion, of emotion. It is not in some ways academically scrutinized to the same extent. I mean, these are all the kind of common criticisms you have that are leveled at anyone who looks at this stuff. But I think what's quite interesting about that is that it comes from the point of view of not being a legitimate form of understanding or appreciating a text. There's something that is kind of cast off as illegitimate, whereas popular culture can be seen as it's shared, it's our experience, it's something that we have an understanding of broadly, and however much we invest into it is however much we get out of it. But with fandom, there's something more emotive and something more of a baseline response, and that is unruly. If we think of it like that, there's something unruly about fandom, because as we've discussed, you know, this idea of that there are numerous sorts of narratives within fandom. There are toxic fandoms. There are fandoms that go into, you know, into dialogue with other texts. So I just thought it was so interesting you said that, because I think there's not much of a better sense of legitimacy of pop culture, but there is, in that kind of string of elevation as such, there is a little bit more legitimacy compared to popular culture. Not that it's much.
Linda, but before you go, I just want to say, I know Kristine Tomlinson, I think, has been waiting to add to this conversation.
Oh yeah, just building off of a couple of things that were just discussed. I think another element to this is sort of the spectrum on both ends of this discussion, a spectrum of what is popular culture or not, a spectrum of what is fandom or not, because I think it's entirely possible to have a piece of popular culture that has a mostly passive audience that's not totally invested in things like proselytizing or trying to bring more people in, or necessarily even really emotionally engaging with the piece of popular culture. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, where you could have very, very unpopular pieces of what might be popular culture, like just a few thousand people know about it, but absolutely love it and it's part of their identity. And then you have people that are very, very emotionally invested in even larger pieces of popular culture. So I think that's an interesting portion of the conversation as well, as just sort of finding these lines in both definitions.
So what I was going to say is, it actually gets a nice segue from Kristine's point, is thinking about, so I have my bias here, and I think of things in terms of what's been authorized, right? So to a certain extent, popular culture artifacts are authorized. They've been given a category, right? They've been kind of given a legitimacy. And that so it's kind of a social contract. We've kind of all agreed on this category of thing. And then fandom doesn't have that. In fact, fandom operates in a deauthorized space, right? It is by very virtue of its existence kind of illegitimate, right? It's this, you know, space outside of, even though I think it's integral, it's kind of like, that's how it's you know, in a certain way perceived. And so thinking of that spectrum as kind of, how is it authorized? Who is authorizing? What is the authority? Is a way of thinking about like that relationship, at least to my mind.
Maria has her hand up.
I think Linda actually pointed out some of what I was going to see if I could draw our attention to, but I think it's really interesting and telling, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts about this, but how much we're bringing legitimacy and authority and authorization into these conversations, because I think that one of the kinds of questions or areas or dialogues that intersections between fandom and popular culture really throw wide open is, what do those things mean in our consumption of a text? Why are there our kind of go-to descriptions? So again, it was just really interesting to hear a couple of people bring those up.
Benjamin?
Yeah, and thank you so much for all of the input. It's fantastic to hear, because I've been thinking about, so we talk about content all this time, and we talk about how do we see the content, and the more I've been thinking about it, I'm like, how does the content see us? What are we to Netflix? Like, is Netflix loving us back? What, the content, the algorithm selection, whether I'm like a fan of the Catholic Church, or, a member of a cult. So, it's like, it's my interpretation of my relationship. But if I'm going on YouTube, how is YouTube seeing me? So how is it classifying me as a fan, a member of the cult? And I'm thinking, so maybe we can also maybe think about how does the content see us, like as fans, as duped, emotionally effective human machines, like these flesh bags who just want the attention of the content. It goes into the, like every of the post-human, I think, but it's like all the greatest, I'm also into comedy research, but just, I picture this like bot online and just like all these fans, like I can trick into clicking me here and left and right and center and giving this and don't giving that. It's this weird relationship, but that's something I'm just getting out of your conversations. Maybe the humans need to be less about, the fan or that. Maybe it's more about the content, actually.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Something that I think is sort of fascinating is pieces of popular culture that really engage directly with fans and fandom. The ones that are coming to mind immediately are like Hannibal and Good Omens, where there's this reciprocal relationship where they're also consuming like fan fiction and things like that, really reaching out to the fans, which I think makes it a different experience from some of the pieces of popular culture that are much more closed off and openly almost aggressive toward those fan expressions. But yeah, very interesting point. Oh yeah, Sherlock as well as one of those closed off ones.
Well, so this is the area I'm exceptionally interested in, Kristine, because I'm highly skeptical of meta narratives, right? Because so as soon as that fourth wall is broken, which I don't really think it's broken, so you see this in Supernatural, right? The fan becomes part of the narrative. But what the problem here is that the fan then gets basically gets represented to the audience, right? So I mean, I actually did a presentation years ago that said keep the fourth wall in your pants. And the reason why is because I think it goes to this idea of false intimacy, right? That there is this sense of you're involved in it, but you're really not involved in it. I mean, and I absolutely love Brian Fuller's approach on Twitter. I mean, I think he's really invested in that, but he's still the canon maker, right? He's and it's like you can't get beyond being the canon maker. Unless you're willing to throw open a lot of economic and social preconceptions that the industry would not let you. I mean, so I'm really interested in those moves, and you see it more and more. I think that especially in the early days. So one of the things I'm really interested in is like Talking Dead, like those properties that try to create authorized spaces of meaning making. Right, that try to infringe back into that space to try to guide, and I think that there's a danger there, because it's like, okay, I'm going to tell you how to read us, because it's Spellman talking about the Falcon and the Winter Soldier yesterday. It's saying fans shouldn't read too much into it, and it's like, no, you don't get to tell me what I get to read and not read. I mean, you're still responsible for the writing, yes, but I'm responsible for my own writing. And my interpretation, to a certain extent, is my writing. So
that is a fundamental misunderstanding from him of who he has watching that show and what that's being created for. I'm just saying.
Well, yeah, and that's why I'm just really fascinated with those relationships, because I do think that there are people who are very sincere about that. Like I think of Fuller, right? I mean, Hannibal. I do think that he's tried to create that space, but it's like, dude, you're still a canon maker. And Orlando Jones did this as well. Like it's like, my question is, Shatner. I mean, Shatner being problematic, but Shatner presents himself as a fan, right? And it's like, can you actually be fans of your, you know, of your own properties? And I'm not sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I can go off for years. Sorry.
What this brings to mind as well is that so far a lot of these examples have been like big media properties with like an authorized production company. You have, you know, stakeholders, it's IP, all that. Another place where this gets even more into like shades of gray is when you have content creators and their parasocial relationships with fans are themselves a part of the popular culture product, if you want to like position it that way. And because that is as much a part of what people are engaging with, proselytizing, etc., as the actual text being produced. And so just as you're discussing these really big IP examples, I'm like, wait a second. And also like there's that even kind of messier example that we could like really delve into.
Yeah, because I also think about, you know, YouTube culture, influencers and things like that. And they're not these, or at least they didn't start off as these massive media industries with a lot of economic capital. But because they developed so much social and cultural capital as they developed their product and they developed a fan base, they then become in some ways similar to that type of idea of you know, Disney's IPs and whatnot. And I think of, I particularly watch Game Grumps, and it's interesting that they'll talk about their fans during their episodes. And, you know, they'll call their fans the lovelies, and they have all these wonderful reflections on their fans. But then they'll also like, you know, talk about the fans who criticize them and, you know, make fun of them. And they recognize that critical gaze, but they don't really change what they do in recognizing the critical gaze. They just kind of make fun of it. And it's that interesting relationship then when you can have that more of a true relationship, and not just a parasocial relationship. And even at that point, you still have the powers up here with the canon makers, and I love that term, up here with the canon makers, and then fans down here, they, you know, they just supply the finances to keep things going, really.
And I wonder if that's where we want to talk about fan fiction, which is obviously my special child. If we want to talk about the canon makers, what about when we disregard canon, which is a basis of much of fan fiction? Is, you know, you see it a lot
everywhere in the world. You have like millions of Star Trek fans getting a heart attack. Like you're just busting the dreams of like generations of like bros in the basements just shaking in their undies. This is sacrilegious, but I love it. I'm here for it.
I know somebody mentioned tags on A03 in the chat, right? You see this even in the tags. People will make jokes about like, the writers won't play nice with my characters, so I'm taking them away, right? You see people will joke about these canon makers don't deserve the characters, so fans are taking that power away. They are retaking control, even in this very specific, very low power arena, right? Like, yeah, they can't make the changes in this big IP area, but they can, in their own little world, make the changes that they want, and then they can go and make these changes and publish them on AO3 and have however many people read them and comment on them and share them. And so I don't know, maybe we should talk about what role fan fiction has in redefining the power structure.
Well, I mean, and I think that's really where, because I think there are two levels here, Colleen. And so one of the things that, and I said it in the chat, one of the things that I'm really interested in right now is the evolution of disownership to ownership, right? So in the early days of fan fiction, right? I mean, and I existed in those early days online. The disclaimer was really important, right? Because, you know, there was a lot of cease and desist orders. I mean, you know, a lot of those things, it was like you had to disclaim, you had to disown, right? And you don't really see that a lot anymore, right? There's not a culture of disownership or disclaiming. In some ways, you know, you'll see it in YouTube and all that. I mean, you know, for fair use. But that the economy of tagging, to my mind, is the evolutionary step, because that was what introduced the attention economy, right? This is where it became, okay, you can see me, I can tag you, you can see me. So now I'm kind of reclaiming. And so looking at those tags as kind of, I mean, I put it in the chat, but as deeds, right? I do think that there is now that's the kind of individual, like, or cultural level. But then there is and this is what I think is really interesting when you see, especially responses from the big IP companies. But even go back to what Carrie Lynn was saying about, you know, even the smaller communities that recognize fans. So I think of it we'll go back to Marvel, right? The big thing with Stucky, with Steve Bucky, right? That huge kind of, you know, controversy. It's clear that the popularity of that has created a response, right? So that culture, that kind of collective culture that is, you know, kind of demanding a particular reading, or is not even so much demanding as is imposing a reading. You start to get like all these different responses, and not only response. I mean, you never get a response from Disney. You never get a response from Marvel, right? So you have kind of this opposite mirror proselytizing, right? So if you have fans proselytizing, you have your actors, your directors, you know, they're on that. They're kind of the mirror, you know, personalities, and so I think that fan fiction is the dirty little secret, right? Because creators are more than happy to retweet fan art. They're more than happy to retweet fan videos. I mean, all that kind of visual culture stuff. But fan fiction is kind of the no-no, right? And part of that is because of Writers Guild and all that. But there also is this sense of that's almost a bridge too far, right? Because now you've gotten into kind of playing inside the text. You're not representing it anymore. Now you're playing inside of it. Now, fan art and fan videos can do that. I'm not saying they don't do that, but there's almost kind of a presupposition about those types of productions versus this textual production, which is kind of much closer to the original type of production. Just my observation thinking about this. So.
Yeah,
Kristine?
thinking on that, it almost seems like kind of is it an embracing of the content or a rejection of the content? And I feel like you're a lot more likely to see a rejection of the content in fan fiction. But like, since we're on the topic of fan fiction, it's also interesting that fan fiction develops its own fandoms as well. Like, we could even read, we're talking about Brian Fuller and Hannibal as a fan fiction. And then, you know, you have things like 50 Shades of Grey, which were born out of straight up fan fiction that developed its own fandom. So I think that these are also interesting elements.
And you can see it in the larger fandoms, right? Where fan writers and fanfic writers have their own following. You know, I mean, this is, you know, I mean, people who are, you know, generate, and it's also long-standing, right? I mean, 5 years later, you're still getting kudos on something, and it's like, okay, thanks.
Well, it's kind of that long tail versus short tail model too. And I just put this word in chat, but I think it's like a fanception when you start getting, you know, the fandoms of the fandoms of the fandoms, and it just starts, you know, keeps going until you get to, I'm not even really sure what you would get to at the bottom, because in Inception, you get to, you know, the subconscious and the unconscious. I'm not sure what the bottom of a fanception would be.
Well, I think this is, I mean, not to, and sorry about this, this is going to sound so pretentious, but I apologize. But I think that that's really where the hermeneutic crisis happens, is that those layers. So when I've taught several fan studies classes, and we talk about this because, you know, of the avenues of accessing the source. but those avenues actually deontologize the source, right? So there is no bottom, because what it makes explicit is there's really no ontology. And I think that that's where there's an existential kind of crisis between pop culture text and fandom, because all of a sudden the author is not the author.
But there is that now I forget who actually said it, about the idea of, oh, Linda, you said that's about the idea of can you be a fan of your own intellectual property? And I think about how, we have this fanception going on and people being fans of fans and whatnot. But then, like Kristine, I think it was, who mentioned, 50 Shades of Grey, that kind of then indicates, a fandom generating new canon, which can then generate new fandoms as well. So you can have it's this larger network, and it kind of goes back to that old idea of, there is nothing new. Everything is just in some way, it's a retelling of what came before it. So you can go back to the ancient times and find maybe the original stories, but even then, because they're written down or passed orally along, most likely they're the fan fiction of the original stories that were told longer before. So it's kind of like we have maybe somewhere in human history the original canon, the original stories, but then everything else has just been the fandoms based and the stuff that was created because of those fandoms.
Which is really threatening to IP producers, stakeholders, etc. Like, oh, wait a second, someone else has a claim to this thing that I'm trying to make money off of. And that is one of the kind of perceived threats of fans. We don't have that power, no. But if you are to locate kind of the roots, the conversations, exactly what you're tracing here in other stories, how does that kind of threaten IP and by extension, content?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that, Maria, it's an economic issue, but it's also, I think, an authorship issue, right? I mean, somebody when they retweeted Fhlainn yesterday, I can't remember who it was, I retweeted it, and it was like, I'm an auteur, right? And it's like there is this sense of kind of not only the economic, I mean, that's going to be the corporate component, right? But then you see all of I think of Anne Rice, right? And, her absolute rebellion against, fan fiction, I own this is mine, right? And this perception of single authorship, when it's okay, and especially in those properties that are televisual, right? That are filmic, that are cinematic, that are collaborative by their very nature, right? Yet they kind of think of themselves as, singular.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, and you can argue one way or another, right? Like whether that's bad, that's good, etc. However, the additional complication is that that works directly against popular culture, which you are trying to disseminate to as many people and as many consumers as possible. Those two things have a very uneasy coexistence. And if you want to succeed commercially, then you're going to have to give up at least a little bit of that. So it's just really interesting to see that kind of double frame of mind.
Maria, just on that point, I thought it was really interesting listening to you on that, because I think if you watch Drag Race, and I'm just getting into this show, it's like, I'm hooked. It's like insane what a bit of a pandemic can do where you're watching that stuff. And it's all about the share economy of the fandom. They're giving away the secrets to the drag, the makeup. And it's all coming, these hands-on fans, and they want them to share because it's a product placement strategy. They want them to be the hands-on fans, and they want them to recreate it, to a certain degree, and then become, part of the context, part of the actual, celebrity game on the reality circuit. So I thought, what kind of, there's an open question, really, I think. So what kind of community is that creating? Because we're talking a lot about narrative, fandom, the story, the origins and that, but with something like, a reality or skills-based drag performance, what's the fandom? What is the story that they're trying to, canonize or recreate? Is it RuPaul? Is it something else? It'd be really interesting to hear from you on that one.
I just want to jump in on that one quick because I study professional wrestling, and one of the concepts in professional wrestling has always been kayfabe, and how you need to accept the fiction, which at the time they didn't want you to think was fiction, they wanted you to think was real, but you're supposed to accept the story as real, and you're not supposed to break kayfabe. So performers, promoters, they were never supposed to, you know, let people in, let the fans in on what was actually going on behind the scenes. But really, since the turn of this century and the rise of the online fan communities, you had a lot of that starting to really occur, and you see more behind the scenes, and you see more, you know, what they would call a shoot, and the idea of this is the real authentic actions and people behind the performance. But then there's also that sense of, well, is it really? Can you ever really be certain that what the promoters like WWE and AEW and all of them, can you ever really be certain that what they're showing you as the authentic behind the scenes is truly the authentic behind the scenes? Or is that just another way that they're trying to control how the fans engage with the text?
I mean, this is the idea I love, this like the real is not real enough idea that really catches on, because you can never produce it real enough. Yeah, I think that's exactly that kind of fandom about the authenticity of the content. It's really coming in, like give us more authenticity, and the wrestlers, you know, they're not bleeding enough, make it more real. And then behind the scenes, you can actually see they're bleeding from that wound, and, you know, they've broken their leg.
I come in there just to say that this is exactly how someone has put it in and Linda's put it in the comments already. But this is also a form of weaponization as well. It weaponizes against the fandoms as well, to say this doesn't, as you say, this doesn't, they're not bleeding enough, or, you know, we can curate and control your concept of what backstage looks like or behind the scenes looks like, or how we really came up with this idea. No, we didn't take it from fandoms, we actually had a script writing room and whatever. So it's a way, it's a form of reasserting control in a period when so little control is felt, because all these decisions about these big IP things are done in boardrooms, are done with numerous writers, in which there are also ghost writers and they're script doctors. And then you have the dialogue with the fandom, and the fandom won't like this, and we're following them on Instagram. And there's so many layers. There just come a point where they say, well, give the perception at least that they have more control than they do. So there is a sense of weaponization there. So that it's very, very, of course, as you say, fanception, or, you know, postmodern layering, it's all there. But it is, in some ways, I would, you know, be cautious of taking it as read entirely, simply because we've seen politically where that's led us already. So.
It's so fascinating.
Well, I mean, this is, I put it in the chat, but I mean, this is the Trump presidency, right? This is, you know, I mean, if you think about like the deep state and even the kind of paratextual QAnon, this is all, I mean, at the same time, you're giving insider knowledge, but at the same time, I'm doing this over here, right? And so this is where, and authenticity is not only weaponized, but it's artificial authenticity, right? So I mean, and it becomes this, and this is why, to go back to my earlier point, I really struggle with meta narratives, because I think that they are, by their very nature, kind of, they're artifice rather than authentic.
I think this conversation right now is also getting us back to that question or critique about why popular culture studies may be seen as more legitimate than fan studies. And it's that affect, that emotional aspect to it. Because we are getting the sense then, if you are a fandom, if you are a fan, as Ben just said in the chat, it's less about the authentic and the objective and the real and the rational and the logical, and it's perceived as being more about the affective and more about those connections and feelings. And to the point then where the authentic doesn't seem to matter as much as the affect. So we'll judge someone as being genuine if we like them, and we won't like, and it's not that we would like them if they're genuine, which is what, you know, had been the Western civilization patriarchal idea of how things were supposed to happen, especially in the politics arena. You're supposed to be on the facts, and you're supposed to be looking for honesty and integrity and genuineness and authenticity and real. But the Trump presidency has definitely indicated that that is possibly not the case. And we might be thinking about it not the case in the Trump presidency, but it also just might not be the case throughout the entirety of human history, especially when it comes to democracy. If we're focused on the affect as what determines what we think is genuine, then is that a problem, or is that, just recognizing what is actually happening?
Well, I think that there is a recognition, but I also think that there's recognizing the affect and also not indulging the affect, because that's when we kind of get to mob rule, right? And which we have come so close to so many times, especially recently, where it's, and this is the vaccine rhetoric, this is the anti-science rhetoric, this is, and part of this is because underlying all of this is the fact that, and Carrie Lynn knows this, I think that Trump will go down as one of the most consequential presidents in the history of the United States, right? And for good or for ill. And one of the reasons why is because he laid bare, right, the fiction, right? No matter what we may think of it, but he laid bare the fiction. And and with that came all the affect, right, that had been kind of repressed, and now all of a sudden is kind of in full bloom. And so I think that our understanding of fan behaviors and fan practices and those parasocial, paratextual, symbiotextual machinations can help us understand how and maybe guide or rebel against sometimes that impetus. The second thing is, and this is where fans are really interesting to me, and fans in pop culture, because I think it's a microcosm example, especially in digital technology and with all of our access to each other and to all these other texts, is just drastically changed the way that we understand expertise, right? And so I believe fans are scholars, right? They are experts. They are the people that know the most. They have studied the most. They have dedicated the time. They have peer review. There is a system in place here, but that system also kind of gives lie to traditional forms of expertise and access and gateways to that expertise, right? So this is where I think that this study is kind of crucial in understanding.
I know we haven't heard from Brianna in a while, so I just want to know if there's anything you'd like to jump in with here.
Not really. Like, as everybody's been talking, I've been thinking about this, and this, might need to bleed into another conversation. But so one of the examples that I was thinking about as everybody was discussing was The Mandalorian, and I follow Pedro Pascal on Twitter, and I've seen in some of Reddit threads that they want that character to be something that I don't think the creators wanted it to be in terms of his sexuality, the Mandalorian sexuality. And I don't know if it's into this conversation of fandom or fandom in general, in terms of fans being able to create this idea and this perception of what they want that character to be versus what the creators intended that character to be. And I don't know if that branches over, and I don't think it's necessarily toxic, but imposing something on a character that may not necessarily be what it should be is kind of what, something I've been struggling with in terms of fandoms since the second season ended.
Maria?
I think this is a super interesting point and a really, really good example of it, because it also opens up this kind of question so what is the purpose of either popular culture or fandom then? Are these spaces and texts where we should look to for representation? Or is that kind of beyond the bounds of what either the community or the text can do? It's one thing for fans, for these online communities to be having this expectation that the Mandalorian, he has a certain sexuality, he has a certain identity, and we can also ask, okay, so our desire to see that, is that something where we should be putting the onus on popular culture, putting the onus on fandom, or on neither? And this is not to say I have an answer to that question. It's just your example there reminded me of that. I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, like, I even like seeing some of the things people comment on his status or his Twitter post. They like want him, you know, they're calling out to Pedro Pascal, you know, to understand or ask, you know, even some of his other characters what their, you know, identities are. And like, I also don't have an answer to that, but it's always been something interesting to, you know, watch online.
There was that interesting clip that went around a couple years ago, and it's of course still being circulated, from Mark Hamill being asked the question if Luke Skywalker is gay, and his response is, well, do you think he's gay? And that's what matters. And that's that interesting relationship too, is I mean, Mark Hamill has no control over what Luke Skywalker, how it would be portrayed. And that's George Lucas, Kathleen Kennedy, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's that recognition of recognizing what the fans want, and maybe that's enough, or is that enough? And that's a big question. Sorry, Kristine.
Oh, I was just going to say, this is also kind of reminding me of something someone brought up, Supernatural, something that happened toward the end of the series, with a lot of fans were very invested in shipping a couple of characters, Dean and Castiel, who were not romantically involved, and essentially the creators picked up on that and recognized this want and desire in the fandom, and then threw basically breadcrumbs in the show, which didn't receive that positive. Like, there was some positive reaction, but a lot of the reaction was very negative, because it was like, oh, they're just trying to pander to us. So you also have these tensions where creators do want to make the fans happy and want to give the fans some insights into things that they may have read into the text, but it's not always effective. And I think fans are pretty savvy when it comes to whether or not they're being effectively or feeling effectively played by the creators.
This is definitely one of the areas where toxic fandom becomes one of the bigger and more interesting factors, is with shipping and queer baiting and representation and parasocial relationships with creators and actors, and it all comes together in this horrible, very awful ball of bad, and interactions with like Brianna was talking about, with harassing, maybe not harassing, but talking to actors about their characters like they have any kind of input, and trying to get Pedro Pascal to make the Mandalorian a certain sexuality, like that's his job. So that would be, that's a very interesting conversation that we don't really have time for today, but it's definitely a conversation that should happen.
Oh, Supernatural. Well, I do think that it goes back, though, to, and I put it in the chat, there's a difference between recognizing and validating, right? And like the need for validation. Now, Supernatural is a very different case study, right? Because they capitalize on its paratextual, it capitalizes very heavily on its paratextual texts, right? Conventions, kind of like they make money off of that, right? So, having, Amisha Collins or Jensen Ackles and all that kind of, addressing those readings within what seems like an authorized space has upped the ante on that affect, in my opinion. And so I think that that's kind of the uber example of how things can go horribly, horribly wrong, right? But I also think that there is a sense of, and this is what I struggle with representation, right? Is it grammatical or syntactical, right? Because it's like, do I want to see it as a grammatical surface thing? Okay, so you have queer characters. My question is, do you have queer writers? Do you have queer producers, right? Do you have queer storytellers? Because, it's the problem with Marvel throwing Fastus at us from the Eternals, right? It's like, okay, we're going to have a queer character. It's like, yeah, but how many of your writers are that? How many of your writers are Black? How many of your writers are brown people? You know, how many of your producers are, you know, because my fear is always the superficial representation. It's like, I see me. It's like, yeah, but I only see me as a minstrel on the screen, right? I don't see me in a writer's room. I don't see me in a production office, right? And so that's right, you know, and so calling on Pedro Pascal to, you know, say, you know, the Mandalorian is gay, or, you know, has this particular sexuality, is another, that's that grammatical move, right? That's what my frustration often is in that discourse. It's like, it still doesn't mean representation, it means minstrelry, right? So yeah.
Well, we're reaching that hour mark here, so we need to start wrapping up. And I think we do have an upcoming dialogue scheduled about popular culture and representation. So we can definitely pick up these threads again there. And if you'd like to be on that conversation, please do let me know. I'm glad to add you there. And I put this in chat, but I think given what I'm hearing here is that we would say maybe that fandom and popular culture have a symbiotic relationship that sometimes becomes parasitic, where sometimes fandom is the parasite to the pop culture and the pop culture is the parasite to the fandom. I don't know if that kind of is a way to sum things up, and I just want to then throw it open to anyone for any last thoughts, any last comments about this relationship and maybe what we need to be looking at.
I think we have to be aware of the kind of, if we're thinking of it as a spectrum, that the idea that there are people who are very controlling of the text as author or as creator, and that, you know, the Rice example was a great one, you know, that refuse to let anyone play with their toys. And then at the same time, there are people who are receptors only, raging that it does not conform to their own very personal, perhaps limited image of what that text can be, and that it is actually a shared thing, a, you know, shared textual experience. And then there's kind of the vast majority of us, I like to think, who are somewhere in the middle, where we feel there's a very strong emotional, obviously economic, social response to texts that, you know, document our lives in a large way. So I think that there's understanding it as sort of a spectrum with these sort of very, very tenuous edges that can be quite sharp and quite divisive. Actually, for the vast majority of us, it actually brings us together more than divides us. So it's actually something that is in the main quite positive, but has all these potential sort of trapdoors that we can fall down into, where we have different expectations that can never fully be met, because popular culture is for us as a mass, for the masses as well. So anyway.
And so at the same time, intellectual property right holders, they want you to share the feeling about the text, but they don't want you to share the text, or, you know, or redesign it. So it's very one-sided.
And they want you to share the right feelings too sometimes. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming in today. This has given me a lot to think about, and I really love this conversation. I love seeing so many new ideas coming out of this too, and I kind of want to share the chat that we've had too, because there's so many great ideas in the chat too. Is it all right if I share that as well?
I'm okay.
Okay, I just want to make sure before I do so, because you're the canon makers of the chat, and I don't want to. And one last thing, maybe as a go away thought here, are academics fans of popular culture studies? Something to possibly take away there. All right, thank you everyone for coming in today, and I hope you all are dealing with the end of your academic terms as well as possible, or as good as possible. Yeah. All right, thank you everyone. Have a good rest of your day and your week.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.